There is a place in the Baltic Sea where the water itself seems to remember. 45 metres beneath the grey churning surface, in waters so cold they slow decay to a crawl, lies the largest unmarked grave in maritime history. No tour boats visit, no diving expeditions descend with cameras and curiosity. The Polish government has sealed this wreck under laws protecting war graves, and the penalty for disturbing it is severe. This is not a forgotten ship. This is a ship the world has chosen not to see. The vessel's name was Wilhelm Gustloff, and on a single frozen night in January 1945, more than 9,000 people died aboard her. That number deserves repetition, deserves the weight of silence after its speaking. More than 9,000 human beings, most of them women, most of them children, all of them fleeing the advancing Red Army in the final desperate months of the Second World War. When the Titanic sank in the North Atlantic, the world wept for 1,500 souls. When the Lusitania went down off the Irish coast, the loss of nearly 1,200 lives helped draw a nation into war. The Wilhelm Gustloff took more lives in 90 minutes than both ships combined, and yet her name rarely surfaces in English-language histories, in documentary catalogues, in the collective memory of the West. Why? That question hangs over this story like the cold Baltic fog that shrouded the ship on her final voyage. The answer lies not in the mechanics of the sinking, not in the torpedoes or the frozen sea, but in the complicated moral landscape of who was dying and who was doing the killing. The passengers aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff were German civilians, refugees from East Prussia, fleeing westward as Soviet forces swept through territories that would never again belong to Germany. They were the losing side. They were the nation that had started the war, that had perpetrated horrors beyond comprehension across Europe. And the Soviet submarine commander who sent 3 torpedoes into the ship's hull was Alexander Marinesko, a man whose own country would treat with suspicion and neglect for decades after. There are no simple heroes in this story. There are no uncomplicated victims, and perhaps that is why the Wilhelm Gustloff rests in such profound obscurity, her wreck sealed off not just by water and law, but by the weight of history's ambivalence. Tonight we descend into that obscurity. We reconstruct what happened on January 30th, 1945, not to assign blame or extract convenient lessons, but to witness, to stand as best we can through the veil of 8 decades, in the shoes of those who crowded onto that doomed vessel, to feel, if only faintly, the cold that killed them. The story begins not with the ship, but with the man whose name she bore. A man whose murder in 1936 would set in motion a chain of symbolism and violence that culminated in the greatest loss of life the seas have ever witnessed. Wilhelm Gustloff was a Swiss-born German who rose to lead the Nazi Party's foreign organisation in Switzerland during the early 1930s. He was a committed National Socialist, an organiser and propagandist who worked to spread Nazi ideology among German expatriates in neutral Switzerland. On February 4th, 1936, a young Jewish medical student named David Frankfurter walked into Gustloff's apartment in Davos and shot him 4 times. Frankfurter surrendered immediately to Swiss authorities, stating that he had acted to protest the persecution of Jews in Germany. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, released early in 1945, and lived until 1982 in Israel. The Nazi regime transformed Gustloff into a martyr. Adolf Hitler himself attended the funeral. The propaganda machine churned out commemorations, and when the Hamburg shipyard Blohm & Voss completed a magnificent new cruise liner in 1937, the vessel was christened after the fallen party member. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not merely a ship, she was a symbol, a floating monument to Nazi ideology and the promise of the Kraft durch Freude program, the Strength Through Joy initiative that offered workers affordable vacations and leisure cruises as proof of the regime's commitment to the common German. The ship was beautiful by the standards of her era. At 208 metres in length and more than 25,000 gross register tons, she featured modern amenities unprecedented in working-class travel. There were no class distinctions aboard, no separate dining rooms for wealthy and poor. Every cabin was the same, every passenger theoretically equal under the beneficence of the Nazi state. Swimming pools, theatres, spacious decks for promenading, modern ventilation systems that kept the air fresh even in the interior corridors. The ship could carry nearly 2,000 passengers in comfort, with a crew of over 400 to attend to their needs. Between 1938 and 1939, the Wilhelm Gustloff operated as a cruise ship, ferrying tens of thousands of German workers on subsidised holidays to destinations throughout Europe. She sailed to Norway, to Madeira, to the Mediterranean. Photographs from these voyages show smiling families on sun-drenched decks, workers experiencing luxuries their parents could never have imagined. The cruises were propaganda triumphs, and the ship became one of the most recognisable symbols of the Nazi leisure programme. Then war came. By September 1939, the pleasure cruises ended. The Wilhelm Gustloff was requisitioned by the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and spent the early war years as a hospital ship stationed in the Baltic, her white hull and red crosses supposedly protecting her from attack under international law. Later, she was redesignated as a floating barracks for the 2nd Submarine Training Division, moored in the port of Gotenhafen, the German name for what is now the Polish city of Gdynia. For years she sat at anchor, her elegant interiors converted to dormitories for submarine trainees, her decks rarely feeling the open sea. The ship might have waited out the entire war in that capacity, a stationary barracks slowly deteriorating, her swimming pool drained, her theatres silent. But by late 1944, the strategic situation in the east had become catastrophic for Germany. The Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, had shattered Army Group Centre and driven German forces hundreds of kilometres westward. By autumn, the Red Army stood at the borders of East Prussia, the easternmost territory of the German Reich. And by January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive was underway, a massive Soviet push that would eventually carry Stalin's armies to the gates of Berlin. For the German civilian population of East Prussia, the Eastern Territories and the Baltic states, the approach of Soviet forces meant terror beyond description. Propaganda had spent years depicting the Slavic East as a realm of subhuman barbarism, but the reality that emerged as Soviet troops entered German-held territory was horrifying even by the debased standards of the Eastern Front. Towns and villages that fell to advancing Soviet units experienced waves of violence. There were mass executions of German officials and suspected Nazi collaborators. There were systematic attacks on civilian populations, and there were atrocities against women and girls that would leave scars on the German national psyche for generations. The town of Nemmersdorf in East Prussia became a byword for this horror. When German forces briefly recaptured the town in October 1944, they found evidence of mass murder and rape. The Nazi propaganda machine amplified these discoveries, and while the details were certainly exaggerated for political effect, the underlying reality was grim enough. As Soviet forces advanced, German civilians fled in terror. Millions abandoned their homes, their possessions, their entire lives, streaming westward on foot, by cart, by any means available, in the depths of one of the coldest winters in memory. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. The roads were clogged with refugees and retreating troops. The only viable escape route for many was the sea, and so the German Navy launched Operation Hannibal, the largest naval evacuation in history, an effort that would ultimately transport more than 2 million civilians and wounded soldiers westward across the Baltic in the final months of the war. It is against this backdrop of mass flight, of frozen terror, of a civilization in its death throes, that the Wilhelm Gustloff received her orders. She would sail from Gotenhafen on January 30th, 1945, carrying as many refugees as she could hold westward to the relative safety of Kiel. The date itself was symbolically charged. January 30th marked the 12th anniversary of Hitler's ascension to the Chancellorship, the founding moment of the Third Reich. Now, 12 years later, the ship named for a Nazi martyr would sail on a desperate rescue mission as that Reich crumbled around it. The scene at Gotenhafen in the days before the sailing defies easy description. The port was chaos incarnate, a roiling mass of humanity pressing toward the waterfront, toward any vessel that might carry them to safety. Temperatures had plunged to minus 18 degrees Celsius. The ground was frozen solid. People stood in lines for hours, for days, clutching identification papers, clutching children, clutching whatever possessions they had managed to carry from homes they would never see again. The official passenger manifest for the Wilhelm Gustloff recorded 6,050 persons. This number was a fiction almost from the moment it was written. The ship's capacity under normal peacetime conditions was approximately 2,000 passengers and crew. But these were not normal conditions. These were the final spasms of total war, and every available space aboard the vessel was filled, and then filled again. Into the staterooms designed for 2 persons went 8, 10, 12 refugees. The drained swimming pool on E-deck was packed with women and children, hundreds of them sitting on the tile floor, their breath fogging in the unheated air. The enclosed promenade decks became dormitories. The dining halls, the theatres, the corridors, every flat surface where a human being could sit or lie became occupied. Estimates of the true number aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff when she cast off range from 9,000 to more than 10,000 souls. The precise figure will never be known, because in the chaos of embarkation no accurate count was possible. Among the passengers were approximately 1,000 German naval officers and men, including hundreds of submarine trainees from the vessel's previous incarnation as a barracks ship. There were several hundred members of the Women's Naval Auxiliary, young women who had served in administrative and support roles for the Kriegsmarine. There were wounded soldiers being evacuated from eastern hospitals, and there were thousands upon thousands of civilians, refugees from East Prussia and the surrounding territories, mothers with infants, elderly couples, children travelling alone after becoming separated from their families in the chaos of flight. One of the survivors, a woman named Helga Reuter, who was 19 years old at the time, later described the scene aboard the ship in terms that still carry their weight decades later. The stench, she said, was overwhelming. So many people crowded together, many of them ill, many suffering from dysentery after weeks of flight through frozen countryside, many unable to reach the overflowing latrines. The noise was constant, a low roar of humanity, crying children, anxious conversations, the creaking of the ship's structure as it struggled to bear its impossible load, and beneath it all, a current of hope. Because they had made it aboard, they were leaving. They would survive. The Wilhelm Gustloff cast off from Gotenhafen on the afternoon of January 30th, 1945. The precise time is recorded as approximately 12:30 in the afternoon. The ship made her way slowly out of the harbour, past the icebreakers working to keep the channel clear, past the hulks of other vessels loading their own desperate human cargoes. The plan called for her to proceed westward along the Pomeranian coast, staying in relatively shallow water where submarine attack was considered less likely, eventually reaching the safety of Kiel. But plans made in January 1945 had a way of coming apart almost immediately upon contact with reality. The ship's captain was Friedrich Petersen, a 64-year-old merchant marine officer who had been recalled to service for the emergency. Petersen was experienced, competent, and thoroughly overwhelmed by the circumstances. His ship was grotesquely overloaded, the weather was deteriorating, and he faced a series of decisions that would prove fateful. The most critical of these decisions involved the question of escort. The Wilhelm Gustloff had originally been assigned to sail in convoy with several other vessels, protected by torpedo boats and minesweepers, but the coordination required for such a convoy proved impossible in the chaos of Gotenhafen. Some vessels were not ready to sail, others had already departed. The escorts available were fewer than promised and less capable than required. What the Wilhelm Gustloff ultimately received was minimal protection. The torpedo boat Lower accompanied her for part of the voyage, but Lower was an aging vessel with mechanical problems of her own. The torpedo boat TF-1 was also assigned, but there was confusion about rendezvous points and timing. For much of the voyage, the Wilhelm Gustloff proceeded with only a single escort, and for portions of the night she may have been entirely alone. The weather presented another terrible dilemma. A storm had been predicted, with heavy seas and poor visibility. In such conditions, submarine attack was less likely, as periscope observation became difficult and torpedo targeting unreliable. Petersen and his officers had to weigh the risks. Should they sail through the storm, accepting the discomfort and danger of heavy seas with a drastically overloaded vessel, but gaining some protection from submarine attack? Or should they wait for calmer weather, delaying the escape but sailing in conditions that favoured the enemy? They chose to sail. As evening fell on January 30th, the Wilhelm Gustloff was proceeding westward along the Pomeranian coast, somewhere north of the town of Stolpmünde. The weather had not yet deteriorated to full storm conditions, though the sea was rough and the temperature remained far below freezing. The ship's navigation lights were off, standard wartime practice to avoid detection, but then came a radio message that another convoy was approaching from the opposite direction, and the fear of collision in the darkness led to a decision that would prove catastrophic. Captain Petersen ordered the navigation lights turned on. In the frozen darkness of the Baltic, the Wilhelm Gustloff became visible. Her running lights glowed against the winter night, marking her position, her course, her speed. And somewhere out in that darkness a Soviet submarine was watching. The S-13 was a Stalinets-class submarine of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, one of the most capable vessels in the Red Navy's submarine arm. Her commander was Captain Third Rank Alexander Marinesko, a 32-year-old officer with a complicated reputation and a desperate need to prove himself. Marinesko's story is its own tragedy within the larger tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff. He was born in Odessa in 1913, the son of a Romanian sailor and a Ukrainian mother. He went to sea young, worked his way up through the Soviet merchant marine, and transferred to the Navy's submarine service in the mid-1930s. By the time of the war, he had established himself as a capable and aggressive commander, sinking several German vessels in the Baltic. But his career was shadowed by problems that reflected the peculiar dangers of serving in Stalin's navy. Marinesko drank. He drank heavily and often, which was not unusual among submarine commanders operating under the extreme stress of Baltic warfare. But in the Soviet military of the 1940s, such behaviour attracted the attention of the political commissars who monitored every unit for signs of ideological or personal unreliability. More seriously, Marinesko had a habit of disappearing while on shore leave, sometimes for days at a time, engaged in romantic affairs that violated military regulations and suggested a troubling lack of discipline. In January 1945, Marinesko was under investigation. His most recent shore leave in Finland had ended with him missing the return of his ship, a dereliction that would normally have resulted in arrest and severe punishment. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, had opened a file on him. His future, if he had one, depended on distinguishing himself in combat before his enemies in the naval bureaucracy could destroy him. The S-13 left the port of Turku, Finland, on January 11, 1945, under orders to patrol the Baltic approaches and attack German shipping. For nearly 3 weeks, Marinesko had found nothing. The submarine cruised through the frozen waters, surfacing at night to recharge batteries, diving during the day to avoid German patrols, finding only empty sea. Then, on the evening of January 30th, the lookout spotted lights. From the conning tower of the S-13, the Wilhelm Gustloff appeared as a constellation of running lights moving through the darkness. Marinesko ordered his submarine to pursue, and for hours the S-13 tracked her target, gradually closing the distance, waiting for the optimal firing position. The attack came at approximately 9:16 in the evening. Marinesko ordered the launch of 4 torpedoes from the forward tubes. 3 of them found their mark. One struck the bow, below the waterline, causing immediate flooding in the forward compartments. Another hit amidships, penetrating the empty swimming pool on E-deck, which had been packed with women and children. The third struck the engine room, killing the engineers instantly and plunging the ship into darkness. The 4th torpedo failed to launch, jamming in its tube, a malfunction that nearly cost the S-13 her own existence, as the armed weapon sat in the forward compartment. Aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, the moment of impact was experienced differently depending on where each person stood or sat or lay in the overcrowded vessel. Those in the forward compartments had no chance. The torpedo's explosion ripped through the hull, and freezing seawater flooded inward with overwhelming force. Those in the swimming pool died almost instantaneously, the torpedo's warhead detonating among them, the shockwave and fragmentation killing hundreds in a single terrible instant. Those in the engine room died with the 3rd torpedo, the explosion and scalding steam and the sudden failure of all electrical systems ending their lives in darkness. But for the thousands of refugees packed into the upper decks, the staterooms, the corridors, the attack marked only the beginning of an ordeal that would last approximately 90 minutes and claim more lives than any other maritime disaster in recorded history. The ship began to list almost immediately, tilting to port as water flooded through the torpedo damage. The emergency lighting flickered on in some sections, stayed dark in others. The temperature inside the ship had been cold before the attack, the heating systems inadequate for the massive overcrowding, but now the winter night rushed in through the wounds in the hull, and the thermometers plunged toward lethal. Panic spread faster than the water. The corridors were jammed with people, thousands of them, all trying to move upward toward the open decks, toward the lifeboats, toward any hope of survival. But the passageways had been designed for a peacetime capacity of 2,000, not the nearly 10,000 souls who now fought to escape. bodies pressed against bodies. Children were lifted above the crush, passed hand over hand toward the exits. The elderly fell and were trampled. The sick, the wounded, those who had been too weak even to walk aboard had no chance at all. The lifeboats presented their own horror. A ship designed for peacetime cruising had lifeboats sufficient for her peacetime complement, not for the masses now aboard. Even those boats that existed could not all be launched. The severe list to port meant that the boats on the high starboard side swung outward, away from the hull, impossible to board. The boats on the low port side hung inward, slamming against the ship's side, difficult to access and dangerous to fill. Some boats were launched successfully, carrying passengers to safety. Others capsized as they hit the water, spilling their occupants into the sea. Others were swamped by waves or struck by debris, or simply vanished into the darkness. The temperature of the Baltic that night has been estimated at approximately 2 degrees Celsius. At such temperatures, an unprotected human being loses consciousness within 15 minutes and dies within 30 to 45 minutes. For those who went into the water without lifeboats, without life vests, without the protective clothing that might have bought them precious additional minutes, death came quickly. The surface of the sea around the sinking ship became carpeted with bodies, floating in their life vests, bobbing in the swells, freezing and dying in the thousands. The cries of those in the water carried across the darkness. Survivors in the lifeboats later described the sound as something beyond human comprehension, a wall of screaming, of pleading, of prayers in German and Polish and Lithuanian and a dozen other languages, rising and falling with the waves, gradually diminishing as one voice after another fell silent. Those in the boats could do nothing. They were already overloaded. To take on more passengers meant capsizing, meant joining the dying in the water. So they sat and listened as the cries grew fewer and finally stopped. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank by the bow. The forward compartments flooded first, dragging the ship's head down while the stern rose grotesquely into the night sky. Those still aboard when the final plunge began had only seconds. The suction, as the great vessel went under, pulled swimmers down, pulled lifeboats closer, created a vortex of churning water and debris that claimed additional lives even after the ship herself had vanished beneath the surface. The time from the first torpedo impact to final submersion has been estimated at between 50 and 70 minutes. In that brief span, more human beings perished than in any other single maritime event in history. The rescue effort was chaotic, inadequate, and desperately heroic. The torpedo boat Löwe, which had been escorting the Wilhelm Gustloff, immediately began pulling survivors from the water. The torpedo boat T-36 arrived on the scene and joined the rescue. The cruiser Admiral Hipper, which had been sailing nearby, altered course toward the disaster site but was forced to depart after fears of submarine attack. Other vessels, German and otherwise, responded to distress signals and began the grim work of searching the frozen sea for survivors. They found precious few. Of the estimated 9,000 to 10,000 people aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff when she sailed from Gotenhafen, fewer than 1,200 survived. Some estimates place the survivor count as low as 900. The precise number of dead will never be known, because the precise number aboard was never accurately recorded. What is certain is that the toll vastly exceeded that of any other ship sinking in history. The Titanic's 1,500 dead, terrible as that number was, represented barely a sixth of the Wilhelm Gustloff's loss. The Lusitania's 1,198 dead were an eighth. Even the later sinkings of the Goya and the General von Steuben in the same desperate Baltic evacuation, horrific disasters in their own right, claiming thousands of lives each, did not approach the magnitude of what happened on the night of January 30th, 1945. The survivors were brought to German ports, treated for hypothermia and injuries, processed through the overwhelmed refugee system. Their stories, in the chaos of the war's final months, attracted little attention. There were too many other horrors competing for notice. The Reich was collapsing. The Soviet armies were advancing toward Berlin. The concentration camps were being liberated in the West. The firebombing of Dresden was 2 weeks away. Against such a backdrop, the loss of a refugee ship, however massive, was simply one more tragedy in an age of tragedies. And then the war ended, and then the Cold War began, and then the silence settled. The Wilhelm Gustloff lay on the bottom of the Baltic, 45 metres down, in waters that had become Polish territorial sea. The wreck was located, surveyed, and left undisturbed. Poland, a nation that had suffered more than almost any other under Nazi occupation, had no interest in memorialising a ship full of German refugees. The Soviet Union, whose submarine had sent those refugees to their deaths, had no interest in commemorating a victory that the West might reframe as a war crime. West Germany, absorbed in its economic miracle and its careful reconstruction of national identity, had no interest in dwelling on the suffering of those who had fled before the Soviet advance, lest such commemoration suggest sympathies that would complicate Cold War alliances. East Germany, a Soviet satellite state, could hardly celebrate the victims of a Soviet attack. The Wilhelm Gustloff fell through the cracks of history, too politically complicated for anyone to claim, too morally ambiguous for anyone to mourn publicly. In the decades that followed, the ship became a kind of ghost, present in the archives, absent from the collective memory. German survivors and their descendants kept the memory alive in private commemorations, in self-published memoirs, in gatherings that attracted little outside attention. Academic historians noted the sinking in footnotes, in specialised studies of the Baltic campaigns, in works that never reached a popular audience. The wreck itself remained sealed. Polish maritime law designated it a war grave, protected under international conventions governing the remains of those who died in armed conflict. Diving to the site was prohibited. Salvage was forbidden. The ship lay in the cold darkness of the Baltic floor, her torpedo wounds still visible, her interior still containing the remains of those who went down with her. The toxic cargo Helga Reuter remembered, the ammunition stores and fuel oil that still sit within the hull, added practical reasons to the legal and moral ones for leaving the wreck undisturbed. And so the Wilhelm Gustloff waits, sealed off from the world of light and memory, her dead uncounted and largely unnamed, her story told only in fragments, in languages that never reach the audiences that might carry her into the broader consciousness of maritime history. Why does this ship remain so obscure in the English-speaking world? The question demands consideration, because the answer reveals something important about how we construct historical memory, how we choose which disasters to commemorate and which to let slip into obscurity. The Titanic's sinking has generated thousands of books, dozens of films, an entire industry of commemoration and analysis. The ship has become a cultural touchstone, a metaphor for hubris and tragedy and the fragility of human confidence. The Lusitania's loss helped shape the geopolitical trajectory of the 20th century, drawing the United States toward involvement in the First World War. These disasters have been woven into the fabric of Western historical consciousness. The Wilhelm Gustloff has not. The reasons are multiple, interlocking, uncomfortable. The victims were German, and they were fleeing the consequences of a war their nation had started, a war waged with unprecedented brutality against the peoples of Eastern Europe. The refugees aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff were not, for the most part, perpetrators of Nazi crimes. They were women, children, wounded soldiers, elderly civilians, caught up in the catastrophe their government had unleashed. But distinguishing between innocent refugees and the nation whose ideology had caused such suffering has always been difficult, and the effort to make that distinction has always been politically charged. The perpetrators of the sinking were Soviet, and in the moral accounting of the Second World War, the Soviet Union occupied an ambiguous position. The Soviets were allies of the Western powers, essential partners in the defeat of Nazi Germany. They were also, as the world would increasingly recognise in the post-war years, perpetrators of their own vast crimes against humanity, regimes of terror and oppression that would endure for decades after the war's end. Condemning the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff as a war crime meant condemning a Soviet action, which complicated Cold War narratives and alignments. And there was the simple, ugly reality that the world's capacity for horror had been exhausted. By 1945, humanity had witnessed atrocities on a scale that numbed the moral imagination. The Holocaust, the Eastern Front, the fire bombings of Germany and Japan, the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the countless smaller massacres and cruelties that characterized the war, all of these had drained the world's reservoirs of outrage and grief. Another 9,000 dead, however horrifying in absolute terms, simply could not register against such a backdrop. So the Wilhelm Gustloff sank not once but twice, first into the waters of the Baltic, and then into the silence of history. The ship lies there still, 45 metres beneath the surface of the sea, in waters too cold for human comfort and too protected by law for human intrusion, the Wilhelm Gustloff rests on her starboard side. The hull is largely intact, though deteriorating with the decades. The torpedo damage remains visible, 3 wounds in the steel plating through which the sea rushed on that frozen January night. Silt has accumulated on the decks and in the compartments. Marine life has colonised the exterior. The interior, dark and inaccessible, still contains the remains of those who could not escape. No memorial service visits this site. No wreaths are laid. The families of the dead, those who still remember, those who still care, have no place to gather except in memory. The ship has become, in the words of one German historian, the largest unmarked grave on earth. And perhaps that is fitting, in a terrible way. Perhaps a tragedy so complicated, so morally ambiguous, so resistant to simple narratives of good and evil, can only exist in this state of suspended memory. The Wilhelm Gustloff does not offer the clean catharsis of the Titanic, where the villain was human arrogance and the victims were unambiguously innocent. She does not offer the political utility of the Lusitania, whose sinking could be channeled into nationalist outrage and geopolitical consequence. She offers only the raw fact of mass death, the frozen bodies of children, the last moments of mothers clutching infants, the screams that faded into the winter night. What do we owe to such dead? What does memory owe to those whose suffering cannot be easily placed in moral categories, whose deaths cannot be mobilized for political purposes, whose stories do not lend themselves to cinematic treatment or inspirational narratives? These questions have no simple answers, but perhaps the act of asking them, the act of descending through the water to consider this ship and her dead, represents a beginning, not an answer, but a beginning. The Wilhelm Gustloff sailed from Gotenhafen on January 30th, 1945, carrying the desperate and the hopeful into the frozen Baltic darkness. She never reached her destination. She has become instead a destination herself, a place of pilgrimage for those willing to make the journey through history rather than through water. What remains to be told is not just the story of the sinking, though that story deserves its full accounting. What remains is the story of the people aboard, the refugees and soldiers and sailors and mothers and children who became, in the space of 90 terrible minutes, the largest collection of the drowned in maritime history. What remains is the story of the submarine commander who fired the torpedoes and spent the rest of his life in the shadow of that night. What remains is the story of the rescue and its failures, of the survivors and their silence, of the wreck and its sealing. The story of how 10,000 souls came to be crowded onto a single ship in the frozen winter of 1945 cannot be understood without first understanding the world that made such desperation necessary. And that world was dying as the Wilhelm Gustloff prepared for her final voyage. By January 1945, the Eastern Front had collapsed into a nightmare of retreat and retribution. The Red Army, having absorbed the most devastating military assault in human history, having lost 20 million of its own citizens to the German invasion, was now advancing westward with a momentum that nothing could stop. Soviet forces had crossed into East Prussia in October of the previous year, and what followed was a reckoning that sent waves of terror through the German civilian population. The town of Nemmersdorf became the first German settlement to fall to Soviet forces, and what happened there, what was reported to have happened there, transformed the nature of the war's final months. German propaganda, always eager to stoke fear, circulated accounts of atrocities committed against civilians. Women violated and murdered, children killed, bodies displayed as warnings. How much was true? How much was exaggerated? How much was invented whole cloth by Goebbels and his Ministry of Lies became and remains a subject of historical debate. But the effect on the German civilian population was immediate and catastrophic. Fear has a power that transcends reason. And in the winter of 1945, fear became the dominant force driving millions of Germans westward, away from the advancing Soviet armies, toward any ship, any train, any conveyance that might carry them to safety. They fled not simply as Germans, not simply as citizens of a collapsing Reich, but as human beings confronting the terrible arithmetic of total war. What you have done will be done to you. What your armies inflicted will be inflicted upon you. The cruelties of occupation will be revisited upon the occupiers. This calculus, accurate or not, fueled the largest mass migration in European history. By some estimates, 10 million German civilians would eventually flee the Eastern Territories in the final months of the war. They travelled by any means available: horse-drawn carts loaded with possessions and grandparents, trains packed beyond capacity, long columns of refugees trudging through snow on roads clogged with retreating military units, and ships that had once carried the Reich's armies to conquest now carried its civilians to exodus. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been built for a different purpose entirely. She was laid down in 1936 at the Blohmen Voss shipyard in Hamburg, commissioned not as a naval vessel, but as a cruise ship for ordinary German workers. The Nazi regime, understanding that ideology alone cannot sustain a nation, had created an organisation called Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy, designed to provide leisure activities and vacations to the German working class. The Wilhelm Gustloff was to be the flagship of this programme, a floating monument to the promise that National Socialism would deliver not only power and glory but comfort and pleasure to the common German. She was named for Wilhelm Gustloff, a leader of the Nazi Party in Switzerland who'd been assassinated in 1936 by a young Jewish man named David Frankfurter. The naming was deliberate, calculated, a way of transforming a propaganda loss into a propaganda opportunity. The ship would carry the martyr's name across the waters of Europe, a constant reminder of sacrifices made and enemies vanquished, and she was beautiful, by the standards of her time, 208 metres in length, more than 25,000 gross registered tons, designed to accommodate nearly 2,000 passengers in unusual egalitarian comfort, all cabins of similar quality because the Nazi aesthetic, at least in its public presentation, rejected the class divisions that characterised British and American ocean liners. No first class, no steerage. All workers equal in the service of the Reich. From 1938 to 1939, the Wilhelm Gustloff carried German workers on cruises through the North Sea and the Mediterranean. Workers who had never seen the ocean boarded at Hamburg and sailed to Norway, to Italy, to the islands of the Atlantic. The propaganda value was immense. Here was proof that National Socialism cared for its people, that the new Germany offered opportunities undreamed of in the decadent democracies. Photographs show smiling families on deck, workers marvelling at foreign ports, the ship gleaming white against blue waters. Then the war came, and everything changed. By September 1939, the cruise days were over. The Wilhelm Gustloff was requisitioned by the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and converted first to a hospital ship. Her pleasure decks transformed into wards for the wounded. Later, she became a floating barracks for the U-boat training division, moored in the Bay of Gdynia, which the Germans had renamed Gotenhafen after their conquest of Poland. For nearly 5 years she sat there, a stationary training facility, her engines cold, her days of sailing seemingly over. The U-boat crews who trained aboard her called her the Gustav. She was home to the 2nd Submarine Training Division, where young men learned the skills they would need to operate the underwater vessels that Germany hoped would strangle British supply lines and turn the tide of the war. These were not combat veterans but apprentices, sailors still learning their craft, most of them teenagers or barely older. They slept in the ship's cabins, ate in her dining rooms, practiced drills on her decks while the war raged elsewhere. By late 1944, that elsewhere had become very close indeed. The Soviet offensive known as the Vistula Uda operation was crushing the German military presence in Poland. Soviet forces had reached the Baltic coast, threatening to cut off the German armies and populations in East Prussia and the other Baltic territories. The port cities that had seemed so secure, so far from the front lines, were suddenly within range of enemy artillery, and the roads leading westward, the overland routes that might have carried refugees to safety, were either cut or clogged with military traffic. The sea remained, cold, hostile, mine-infested, submarine-hunted, but open, and the only way out for hundreds of thousands of trapped civilians. Operation Hannibal was the name given to the German naval evacuation that began in late January 1944. Named after the Carthaginian general who had crossed the Alps with elephants. The operation was Germany's Dunkirk in reverse, a desperate attempt to extract military personnel and civilians from territories that could no longer be held. Every available vessel was pressed into service. Cargo ships, passenger liners, military transports, fishing boats, anything that could float and carry passengers. The Wilhelm Gustloff, having sat idle for years, was reactivated. Her engines, long dormant, were coaxed back to life. Her spaces, configured for U-boat training, were hastily reorganised to accommodate passengers. The question was not whether she was suited for such a voyage, whether her ancient lifeboats were adequate, whether her crew had practised emergency procedures. The question was only whether she could sail at all. She could, and so she was pressed into service for what would be her final voyage. The passengers began arriving in Gotenhafen days before departure. They came by every means imaginable. Some had walked for weeks across frozen landscapes, dragging children and possessions through snow. Some had waited in the port for days, sleeping in the open or in the ruins of bombed buildings, praying for a berth on any ship heading west. Some had connections, military or political, that placed them higher on the evacuation lists. Some simply arrived at the right moment, when a gap in the crowd allowed them to push forward to a gangway. The official manifest of the Wilhelm Gustloff has never been fully recovered. What documents existed were lost when the ship sank, and the chaos of the final days made any accurate count impossible. But historians have pieced together the approximate composition of those aboard. There were the naval personnel, the crew and the submarine trainees. Approximately 918 officers and men of the U-boat training division, young men barely out of adolescence, their training interrupted by the order to evacuate. Many of them had never seen combat. Now they found themselves passengers on a ship sailing through waters they had studied from the safety of classrooms. There were the naval auxiliary women, the Marinhelferinnen, who had served in support roles throughout the war. Approximately 373 of them, according to the best estimates, young women who had typed messages and filed reports and maintained the bureaucratic machinery of naval operations. They boarded in organised groups still in uniform, their presence adding a strange formality to the chaos around them. There were the wounded, soldiers evacuated from military hospitals in the collapsing Eastern Territories. How many exactly remains uncertain, but they occupied spaces throughout the ship, some on stretchers, some ambulatory but damaged in ways visible and invisible by years of brutal warfare. And then there were the refugees, the civilians, the families. They numbered somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000, though the true figure will never be known with certainty. Women predominated, along with children and the elderly. The men of military age had been conscripted, sent to the fronts, consumed by the war machine. What remained were the dependents, the non-combatants, the human beings who had no military value, but who nonetheless found themselves in the path of annihilation. Mothers carried infants wrapped in every available layer of clothing. Children clutched the hands of grandparents. Pregnant women, some in their final weeks, somehow found the strength to climb the gangways. Families who had been separated in the chaos of evacuation pushed through crowds, calling out names, desperate to board the same ship, terrified of being left behind or sent to different destinations. The loading process took days, and as more and more passengers crowded aboard, the ship's officers faced an impossible arithmetic. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been designed to carry just under 2,000 passengers in comfort. She had lifeboats and life rafts for perhaps that many, though not all were serviceable after years of sitting idle. The regulations governing passenger capacity had been developed for peacetime, for orderly cruises where safety mattered more than speed. But this was not peacetime. This was the end of a world. When the protests of safety-minded officers collided with the demands of evacuation commanders, the demands won. More passengers, more refugees. Crowd them into the dining halls and the lounges and the corridors. Fill the enclosed swimming pool on the lower deck. Pack them in wherever there is space to stand. The alternative is to leave them behind for the Russians. And so, the Wilhelm Gustloff became a floating city of the damned and the desperate. A vessel carrying more than 10,000 souls into waters that had become a hunting ground for Soviet submarines. The captain of the ship was Friedrich Petersen, a civilian merchant marine officer recalled to naval service. He had commanded the Wilhelm Gustloff during her peacetime cruises, knew her quirks and capabilities as well as anyone alive. But he was 64 years old, in poor health, and faced with circumstances that no training could have prepared him for. The ship he had once guided through pleasure cruises was now a refugee ark. Her systems strained beyond design parameters, her crew a mix of naval personnel and hastily recruited civilians. Alongside him, and in conflict with him, were other officers with their own authorities and agendas. Naval commanders oversaw the military personnel aboard. Port officials pressed for immediate departure. Everyone had opinions about when to leave, what route to take, whether to travel in convoy or alone, whether to zigzag through the mined waters or steam straight for safety. The departure itself was repeatedly delayed. Originally scheduled for January 29th, the ship remained at anchor as final passengers were loaded, as repairs were made to engines that had sat idle too long, as debates raged over the safest course. Each hour of delay was another hour for Soviet forces to advance, another hour for refugees to crowd the docks, another hour for the fear to deepen. Finally, on the afternoon of January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff began to move. It was a Tuesday, the 12th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's rise to power, though that coincidence brought no celebration aboard the desperate ship. The ice-cold waters of the bay opened before her bow as she steamed toward the open Baltic. The weather was brutal, temperatures far below freezing, heavy snow falling from a sky that seemed to press down upon the sea, visibility minimal. These conditions, so hostile to human comfort, offered at least one advantage. Submarine commanders depended on visual contact to aim their torpedoes. A blizzard made the ship harder to spot. But the storm also grounded the Luftwaffe squadrons that might have provided air cover. German aircraft that could have patrolled the waters, driving off Soviet submariners, remained at their bases. The Wilhelm Gustloff would sail with only minimal escort, a single torpedo boat for much of the voyage, later joined by a second vessel. Against the submarine threat that everyone knew lurked beneath the waves, this was almost no protection at all. The ship's navigation lights were off. Blackout conditions prevailed. The passengers, crowded into every available space, could see nothing of the sea they crossed except occasional glimpses through ice-crusted portholes. Most had no idea of the route being taken, no understanding of the debates raging on the bridge about whether to stay in the shallow coastal waters where mines were thickest, or venture into the deeper channels where submarines had more room to manoeuvre. The decision that would prove fatal was made as the ship rounded the Gila Peninsula. A message arrived warning of an approaching convoy of minesweepers. To avoid collision, the captain ordered the navigation lights turned on. It was a reasonable decision in the context of the immediate threat. But in the larger context, it transformed the Wilhelm Gustloff from a dark shape moving through darkness into a glowing target visible for miles in every direction. And somewhere in those dark waters, a Soviet submarine was watching. The S-13 was commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, a figure who would become central to the story of that night, and who would spend the rest of his life unable to escape the shadow of what he did. Marinesko was 32 years old, ethnically Ukrainian, a career naval officer who had risen through the ranks of the Soviet submarine service. He was also a man with problems, disciplinary issues that had repeatedly threatened his career. In the weeks before the sinking, Marinesko had been absent without leave in Finland, drinking and engaging in activities that violated military regulations. He faced potential court-martial upon his return. By some accounts, the patrol that would end in the Wilhelm Gustloff's destruction was his last chance to redeem himself, to prove his worth before the consequences of his misconduct caught up with him. The S-13 had been hunting in the Baltic since early January, seeking targets of opportunity among the German shipping that filled the sea lanes. Conditions were difficult. The cold affected equipment. The presence of German naval patrols made surface operations dangerous. Marinesko had fired torpedoes at other ships without success. His reputation, and perhaps his freedom, depended on finding a worthy target. And then, through the snow and darkness, he saw lights. The Wilhelm Gustloff was making approximately 12 knots, moving steadily through the water towards safety that seemed so close and would prove so unreachable. Her passengers, exhausted from the journey and the weeks of flight that had preceded it, tried to find comfort in spaces never designed for so many bodies. Some slept, some prayed, some stood on deck despite the cold, watching the darkness, unable to rest. Captain Marinesko manoeuvred the S-13 into attack position. The process took time in the rough seas. Waves battered the submarine. Equipment malfunctioned. The target, though lit, was moving through conditions that made precise aiming difficult. But Marinesko was patient and skilled and desperate. The torpedo tubes were loaded with 4 weapons. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, Marinesko gave the order to fire. The first torpedo struck the port side of the Wilhelm Gustloff below the waterline near the bow. The explosion tore through crew quarters, killing an unknown number instantly. The second torpedo struck farther aft, devastating the area where the naval auxiliary women were quartered. The third struck near the engine room, crippling the ship's power systems. The fourth torpedo failed to launch, a mechanical malfunction that spared the ship whatever additional damage it might have caused. But 3 torpedoes were enough. The lights went out throughout the vessel as the electrical systems failed. Emergency generators provided some illumination, but much of the ship was plunged into darkness. The massive inrush of seawater through 3 gaping wounds began to drag the bow downward almost immediately. The ship was dying, and she was dying fast. What happened in the next 50 to 60 minutes has been reconstructed from the accounts of survivors, from investigations conducted in the years after the war, from the physical evidence that remains on the seafloor. It was chaos in the truest sense of the word, thousands of human beings confronting their own mortality in darkness and cold, each making decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. The lifeboats posed the first terrible challenge. Many had been frozen in their davits, locked in place by ice accumulated during the voyage. Crews struggled to free them with whatever tools were available, axes and bare hands and desperation. Some boats swung free only to crash against the tilting hull or capsize upon hitting the water. Others launched successfully, but were immediately swamped by waves or crushed against the ship as she rolled. The life rafts should have provided alternative salvation, but here too the cold had done its work. Release mechanisms were frozen. Rafts that should have deployed automatically remained stubbornly attached. Those that did reach the water were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of people trying to climb aboard. And then there were the people for whom no boat, no raft, no salvation existed at all. The enclosed swimming pool on the lower deck had been converted into sleeping quarters for mothers and children. Hundreds of the youngest refugees were quartered there, along with women pregnant or nursing, the most vulnerable passengers given what seemed like protected interior space. When the torpedoes struck, when the power failed, when the water began to pour in, these passengers faced a geography of doom. The pool room was below the waterline. The corridors leading to the deck were crowded, unlighted, increasingly flooded. Escape was nearly impossible. Water rose around mothers clutching children to their chests. Women who had walked hundreds of miles to reach this ship, who'd survived air attacks and artillery and the collapse of everything they knew, found themselves trapped in a darkness that no amount of courage could overcome. The sounds in that space, in those final minutes, are beyond imagination and beyond description. Throughout the ship, similar scenes were playing out. Passengers who had finally found sleep were awakened by explosions and screaming. The old and infirm, the wounded soldiers who could not move without assistance, the children separated from their parents in the chaos, all found themselves struggling against a ship that was actively trying to die beneath them. The tilt of the deck made movement nearly impossible. Stairs that had been manageable became cliffs. Corridors became obstacles, courses of fallen bodies and broken equipment. Passengers climbing toward the deck found their way blocked by locked doors, by collapsed structures, by the simple arithmetic of too many people trying to move through too few spaces. Those who reached the outer decks found conditions scarcely better. The temperature was approximately 18 degrees below 0 Celsius. The wind carried snow and spray that froze on contact with skin and clothing. The sea itself was waiting, dark and hostile, offering death within minutes to anyone who entered unprepared. Some jumped anyway, unable to face the ship that was clearly going down. Some were washed overboard as waves broke across the tilting deck. Some managed to reach lifeboats or rafts. Some clung to debris, to ropes, to each other, waiting for rescue that might never come. The escort vessels that had accompanied the Wilhelm Gustloff now faced an impossible task. The torpedo boat Lover had been sailing nearby when the explosions tore through the night, and her crew immediately understood that something catastrophic had occurred. But understanding and responding are different things entirely in the chaos of a maritime disaster. The Lover turned toward the stricken liner, her searchlights cutting through the darkness and the snow, illuminating a scene that would haunt every sailor who witnessed it. The Wilhelm Gustloff was listing heavily to port, her bow already settling into the water, her deck swarming with figures barely visible in the distance. And surrounding her, already in the water, were hundreds of people. Small dark shapes against the darker sea, some moving, some still, all of them dying by degrees as the Baltic claimed them. The rescue operation that followed was heroic and inadequate in equal measure. The Loew and the few other escort vessels that could respond began pulling survivors from the water, but the mathematics were merciless. Each person rescued required time, required hands reaching down to grasp frozen fingers that could barely grip in return, required space on decks that were never designed to accommodate mass rescue operations. And while each rescue was being completed, dozens more people were entering the water, were succumbing to the cold, were slipping beneath the surface one by one. The cold itself was the primary killer. In water temperatures hovering just above freezing, the human body loses heat faster than it can generate it. Core temperature drops. The heart struggles to pump blood that is growing sluggish and cold. Muscles seize. Consciousness dims. A healthy adult in such conditions might survive 15 to 20 minutes, perhaps 30 if fortunate. Children, with their smaller bodies and greater surface-to-mass ratios, died faster. The elderly, the ill, the exhausted died faster still. Many who entered the water alive were corpses within minutes, their bodies floating on the surface or slipping into the depths as life abandoned them. Those who managed to reach lifeboats or rafts faced only marginally better odds. The boats were exposed to the same wind, the same cold, the same spray that froze on contact. Survivors huddled together for warmth that was insufficient, watching the Wilhelm Gustloff in her final moments. She had taken perhaps 50 minutes to die, though in the darkness and the terror, time had ceased to mean much. Some survivors recall it taking hours, some recall it lasting only minutes. Human memory, confronted with trauma of this magnitude, becomes unreliable, fragmentary, a series of images and sensations rather than a coherent narrative. What remains consistent across the accounts is the sound of the ship as she broke apart, metal screaming against metal, structures collapsing, air escaping through shattered compartments in great rushing sighs. The sound of human voices raised in terror, in prayer, in calls for help that would not come. And then, eventually, the sound of silence. The Wilhelm Gustloff went under approximately an hour after the first torpedo struck, her lights extinguished, her hull sliding beneath the surface at an angle, her massive form disappearing into water that was 50 meters deep at that location. She did not sink into the abyss like Titanic, settling on some distant seafloor miles below. She simply dropped to the bottom of the Baltic, close enough to the surface that her superstructure would remain visible for years afterward, close enough that salvage operations would eventually be contemplated though never completed. When dawn finally came to the Baltic on that January morning, the rescue vessels found a sea strewn with debris and with death. Bodies floated everywhere, most of them small, most of them wearing clothing inadequate for the conditions, most of them bearing expressions that the rescuers would never be able to forget. The living were far fewer than the dead, and even among the living many would not survive the day. Hypothermia continued its work even after rescue, as bodies too cold to function properly simply gave out despite being removed from the water. Some survivors died on the decks of rescue ships, warmth returning to their extremities too late to save their failing hearts. Some died in the hospitals of Sassnitz and Swinemünde, where medical personnel worked desperately to save what could be saved. Some survived the immediate aftermath only to succumb days or weeks later to pneumonia, to shock, to injuries sustained in the chaos of the sinking. The final death toll would never be known with precision. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been carrying far more passengers than any manifest recorded. Refugees had boarded without documentation. Families had been separated during the loading process. Children had been placed on the ship by parents who remained behind. The official records that did exist were incomplete, contradictory, in some cases deliberately falsified. Estimates of the dead have ranged from as few as 6,000 to as many as 10,000, with most historians settling on a figure of approximately 9,400. To understand the magnitude of this number, consider that the Titanic disaster claimed approximately 1,500 lives. The sinking of the Lusitania killed nearly 1,200. The Wilhelm Gustloff, in a single frozen hour in the Baltic, killed more than 6 times as many as Titanic. She killed more than the Titanic and Lusitania and Britannic combined. She killed more people than any other maritime disaster in recorded history before or since. And yet this catastrophe, this death of 9,000 souls in a single night, would be largely forgotten by the wider world. The war was still raging when the Wilhelm Gustloff went down. Germany was clearly losing, her cities burning, her armies in retreat, her population facing the consequences of a war their leaders had begun. The Allied nations had no interest in mourning German dead. inhumanizing an enemy they were still actively fighting. And Germany itself, consumed by the chaos of collapse, had little capacity to commemorate a disaster that was merely one catastrophe among many. The sinking was reported in German newspapers, but the reporting was muted, controlled, stripped of the details that might have sparked panic among a population already desperate to flee westward. Goebbels and the propaganda ministry faced an impossible choice. Publicising the disaster might generate hatred for the enemy, but it might also discourage the very evacuations that were essential to moving soldiers and civilians out of the Soviet path. The story was acknowledged but not amplified. Grief was private. The dead were buried in memory rather than in ground. In the immediate aftermath, those who survived faced the task of continuing to live in a world that was collapsing around them. The refugees who made it to the western Baltic ports found temporary shelter in facilities already overwhelmed by the tide of displacement. They searched for family members from whom they had been separated. They waited for news that usually did not come. They tried to find food, warmth, some sense of safety in a nation that could no longer provide any of these things reliably. Many of the survivors would continue fleeing westward in the weeks and months that followed, staying ahead of the Soviet advance until the war finally ended in May. They would end up in displaced persons camps, in the occupation zones of the Western Allies, in new homes in distant countries where they would rebuild lives from nothing. The stories they carried with them were stories they often could not tell. Who wanted to hear about German suffering in the years immediately following the war? Who wanted to acknowledge that victims and perpetrators could sometimes be the same people, or at least the same population? The survivors of the Wilhelm Gustloff found themselves holding a grief that had no public space for expression, no memorial, no anniversary observance, no collective mourning ritual to help process what they had experienced. They remembered privately, if they remembered at all. Some found the memories too painful to revisit. Some found that speaking of their experience was met with indifference or hostility. Some carried their stories in silence for decades, waiting for a time when the world might be willing to listen. The wreck itself became a kind of ghost ship, present but unacknowledged, resting on the floor of the Baltic in waters that would become increasingly contested in the post-war years. The territory that had been East Prussia was divided between the Soviet Union and Poland. The coastline from which the Wilhelm Gustloff had sailed was now Soviet. The waters where she sank were now claimed by different nations than those that had existed when she went down. The ship that had once represented German strength and leisure now represented German loss and defeat, a symbol too complicated for any nation to want to claim. In the years immediately following the war, the wreck was visible from the surface at low tide, her superstructure protruding above the waves like a warning or a tombstone. Ships passing through the area gave her a wide berth, uncertain what hazards she might pose to navigation, unwilling perhaps to pass too close to so much death. Salvage operations were discussed but never seriously attempted. What was there to salvage after all? The ship's valuables had been largely limited to the personal possessions of refugees, items of sentimental value rather than material worth. Her machinery was obsolete, her hull compromised, her position in shallow water making her difficult to raise, and of limited value even if raised. The Soviets showed some interest in the wreck, conducting surveys and investigations in the years following the war. Their motives were likely practical rather than memorial. A ship of that size represented both a navigational hazard and a potential source of recoverable material. Soviet divers examined the wreck, documented its condition, assessed the feasibility of salvage. They found a ship that was remarkably intact despite the violence of her sinking. The torpedoes had opened her hull in 3 places, but her basic structure remained coherent. She lay on her port side at the bottom, her starboard flank rising toward the surface, her deck and superstructure still recognizable despite years of immersion. And within her, trapped in corridors and cabins and holds that had become underwater tombs, were the remains of thousands who had never escaped. The Soviet investigations were eventually abandoned. The Cold War made the Baltic a frontier zone, a contested space where East and West watched each other with suspicion. The wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff sat in waters that were now strategically sensitive, and diving operations in such areas became increasingly complicated and politically charged. The ship was left to decay in silence, her existence acknowledged by nautical charts that warned mariners of her location, her story largely untold in the official histories of either East or West. In West Germany, the survivors who had ended up on the Allied side of the Iron Curtain attempted to keep the memory alive. Survivor associations were formed, modest memorials were erected, anniversary gatherings were held. But these efforts struggled against the broader currents of post-war German culture, which was focused on rebuilding, on integrating into the Western Alliance, on distancing itself from the recent past. The expellees from the Eastern Territories were a politically complicated group, their demands for recognition of their losses sometimes interpreted as revisionism, as a refusal to accept the territorial settlements that had ended the war. Speaking of German victimhood was fraught in a nation still processing its role as perpetrator. The Wilhelm Gustloff survivors found themselves caught between a memory they could not abandon and a public discourse that had little space for their particular grief. In East Germany, the story was even more suppressed. The official narrative of the German Democratic Republic emphasized the crimes of fascism and the liberation brought by the Soviet Union. German suffering at the hands of Soviet forces did not fit this narrative and was actively discouraged. The residents of East Germany who had family connections to the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster, who had lost relatives or who themselves had survived, learned to keep these memories private. Speaking openly of what the Soviet submarine had done, of the refugees who had died fleeing the Red Army, was not merely socially awkward but potentially dangerous. The state had defined who the victims were and who the perpetrators were, and individual memories that complicated this framework were not welcome. The wreck continued its slow decay on the seafloor, visited occasionally by divers who braved the cold and the depth and the legal restrictions to document what remained. The ship's structure had deteriorated over the decades. Fishing nets had caught on her superstructure. Currents had shifted sediment around and through her compartments. The bodies that had been trapped within her had long since been reduced to bone, to artifact, to absence. Yet she remained unmistakably a ship, unmistakably a grave, unmistakably a monument to something that most of the world had chosen to forget. The turning point, if one can identify a single moment when the story began to emerge from obscurity, came in the late 20th century as Germany itself began to reckon more openly with the complexity of its past. The reunification of Germany in 1990 brought together populations that had processed the war in fundamentally different ways. The expellees from the Eastern Territories, who had been a politically active group in West Germany, suddenly had contact with East Germans who had been forbidden from discussing similar experiences. The conversation about German suffering during and after the war became possible in ways it had not been before. Into this opening came renewed attention to the Wilhelm Gustloff, not as German propaganda or revisionist history, but as a genuine human tragedy that had been obscured by the larger catastrophe of the war. Documentaries were produced, primarily in German, that interviewed the dwindling population of survivors and documented their experiences. Books were written that attempted to reconstruct the events of that January night. The German author Günter Grass published a novella in 2002 titled Crabwalk that used the sinking as its central historical anchor, bringing the story to a literary audience that might not have encountered it otherwise. The wreck itself came under increased scrutiny and protection. Poland, in whose territorial waters the Wilhelm Gustloff now rested, declared the site a protected war grave. Diving on the wreck without special permission was prohibited. The prohibition was justified on multiple grounds, as a matter of respect for the dead, as a matter of safety given the unstable structure and the depth, and as a matter of environmental protection. The ship had gone down carrying not only passengers but fuel oil, and this oil remained within her tanks, leaking slowly into the Baltic over the decades, a toxic legacy that added practical concerns to the historical and memorial ones. The restriction on diving had the effect of preserving the wreck in a kind of suspended state. Unlike Titanic, which has been exhaustively documented and visited by countless expeditions, the Wilhelm Gustloff remains largely unseen. The images that exist are limited, often grainy, taken during brief authorised dives or by remotely operated vehicles. The interior of the ship, where most of the passengers died, has rarely been entered since the disaster itself. What remains there is unknown, a darkness within a darkness, a space that holds whatever the sea has left of 9,000 bodies and their possessions. The arguments for leaving the wreck undisturbed are compelling. This is a grave, advocates argue, and graves deserve respect. The dead cannot consent to being photographed, to being studied, to being made into spectacle for documentary audiences. Their descendants, those who survive, have the right to know that their family members rest in peace rather than being subjects of exploration. The wreck is unstable, and each dive risks further collapse, further disturbance of remains that have settled into whatever final positions the sea has allowed. But there are counter-arguments as well, arguments that are rarely made openly but that hover around any discussion of the site. The Wilhelm Gustloff contains the remains of soldiers as well as civilians, some of whom may have been complicit in the crimes of the regime they served. The refugees who boarded were fleeing consequences of a war their nation had started, a war that had killed tens of millions across Europe and beyond. Does their tragedy deserve the same memorial treatment as the victims of German aggression? Can German suffering be acknowledged without diminishing the suffering Germany caused? These questions have no easy answers, and they continue to shape how the story is told and whether it is told at all. The wreck waits in the cold darkness of the Baltic, her hull slowly collapsing under the weight of decades, her presence a fact that cannot be disputed even if its meaning remains contested. Ships pass above her daily, most of them unaware of what lies below. The passengers on those ships, the tourists and merchants and sailors going about their modern lives, travel over a grave that dwarfs anything they could imagine. The Baltic itself has become a kind of guardian, though perhaps guardian is too gentle a word. The sea that claimed the Wilhelm Gustloff has proved itself both preservative and destructive, holding the wreck in conditions that slow decay while simultaneously crushing and collapsing the structure under pressures that no human engineering was meant to endure for 80 years. The water temperature at the wreck site hovers just above freezing year-round, cold enough to inhibit the bacterial processes that would otherwise consume organic material, cold enough to preserve what might elsewhere have vanished within months. The salinity of the Baltic is lower than that of the open ocean, a consequence of the sea's semi-enclosed nature and the freshwater rivers that feed into it, and this reduced salinity creates conditions distinct from those found in the Atlantic or the Pacific. The organisms that thrive in full-strength seawater, the shipworms and boring creatures that can reduce a wooden hull to nothing within decades, are less active here, less voracious. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built of steel, not wood, but even steel succumbs to the sea given enough time, and the cold, brackish waters of the Baltic have slowed that succumbing in ways that deeper, saltier, warmer waters would not. Yet slowness is not stasis. The wreck has changed since that January night, changed continuously, and will continue changing until there is nothing left that resembles a ship at all. The deck that refugees crowded onto in those final desperate minutes has partially collapsed inward, the steel plating weakened by corrosion and crushed by the weight of water above. The superstructure, the bridge and the funnels, and the observation decks where passengers once watched the coastline slide past, has suffered damage from both the initial impact with the seafloor and from decades of slow deterioration. Sections that stood intact when the ship first settled have since given way, opening new spaces to the infiltration of silt and water while sealing others off entirely. The interior compartments, the dining halls and staterooms and nurseries where families huddled against the cold, have become a maze of collapsed bulkheads and accumulated debris. Entering these spaces would be dangerous under the best circumstances, navigating through darkness and silt, through doorways that may or may not still be passable, through corridors that lead nowhere but to further collapse. The authorised surveys that have been conducted, limited in scope and brief in duration, have documented only a fraction of the wreck's current state. Remote cameras have captured images of the hull exterior, showing the torpedo damage that remains visible even now, the gaping wound where S-13's weapons struck home. Sonar imaging has mapped the general outline of the wreck, her position on the seafloor, her orientation relative to the surface. But the interior remains largely unexamined, a volume of space perhaps equivalent to a small apartment building filled with water and silt and whatever the sea has made of 9,000 human beings and their possessions. The prohibition on diving has meant that detailed interior surveys have simply not been attempted. What lies within is extrapolated from what the ship was before the sinking, from the deck plans and passenger manifests and the testimony of survivors, rather than observed directly. Some debris has escaped the wreck over the decades, carried by currents or released as the structure deteriorated. Fragments of the ship's fittings, pieces of furniture, personal effects once belonging to passengers, these have been found scattered across the seabed in the vicinity of the main wreck site. Fishing nets have occasionally brought up objects from the area, mundane items transformed into relics by the circumstances of their loss. a shoe, a piece of luggage hardware, a fragment of ceramic that might have been part of a dinner service or a child's toy. Each recovered object carries the weight of its provenance. Each one represents a story that ended in those waters, though the specific story, the specific owner, the specific moment of loss, these details are almost always irrecoverable. The fuel oil that the Wilhelm Gustloff carried in her bunkers when she sank has become one of the most pressing practical concerns surrounding the wreck. She was a large vessel requiring large quantities of fuel to operate, and while the exact amount aboard at the time of sinking has never been precisely determined, estimates suggest hundreds of tons of heavy fuel oil remain within her tanks. This oil has been leaking slowly since the disaster, seeping through corroded tank walls and rising toward the surface in periodic releases that have been detected and documented over the years. The Baltic Sea is one of the most heavily trafficked and environmentally monitored bodies of water in the world, and any significant oil release draws attention from both environmental agencies and the public. The potential for a catastrophic release, should the remaining tanks fail suddenly rather than continuing their slow leak, represents an environmental risk that Polish authorities have had to weigh against the historical and memorial considerations that argue for leaving the wreck undisturbed. Various proposals have been made over the years for addressing the oil threat. Some have suggested pumping the remaining fuel from the tanks, a technically challenging operation that would require substantial intervention with the wreck, but that could eliminate the ongoing environmental hazard. Others have argued that any such operation would necessarily disturb the wreck site, would require equipment and personnel to work in close proximity to human remains, would constitute a violation of the war grave protections that currently govern the site. The debate continues without resolution, a collision between environmental imperatives and memorial ones, between practical concerns about an ongoing pollution source and ethical concerns about the sanctity of the dead. The oil continues to leak, a drop here, a sheen there, the Wilhelm Gustloff bleeding her last cargo into waters that are themselves struggling under the accumulated burden of decades of industrial and agricultural pollution. The dead themselves, the 9,000 and more whose final moments played out in those freezing waters, have undergone transformations that are difficult to contemplate and impossible to observe. Human remains in water follow patterns that science understands well enough in the abstract, but that become unspeakably concrete when applied to specific bodies, to specific people with names and histories and families who mourned them. The cold has slowed decomposition, preserving some remains far longer than they would have lasted in warmer conditions. The enclosed spaces within the wreck, compartments sealed by debris or by collapsed passages, have created micro-environments where the usual processes of decay have been further impeded. What lies within those spaces, whether recognisable as human or transformed into something else entirely, whether preserved in positions of desperate flight or scattered by the violence of the flooding and the subsequent decades, this remains unknown because it remains unseen. Some remains have certainly dispersed beyond the wreck itself. The initial flooding would have carried bodies through passages and openings, depositing them wherever the currents willed. The fishing boats that work the area have occasionally reported nets heavy, with something other than fish, though such reports are handled with discretion, and the contents returned to the sea with whatever ceremony circumstance allows. The seabed around the wreck site is designated as part of the protected zone, but the boundaries are somewhat arbitrary, and human remains may well have travelled beyond them in the decades since the sinking. The Baltic receives bodies from other sources as well, from accidents and suicides and the occasional crime, and the waters do not distinguish between a refugee drowned in 1945 and a sailor lost in 2023. The sea takes what it is given and transforms it according to its own logic, a logic that predates humanity and will continue long after humanity is gone. The question of identification has been effectively abandoned for the vast majority of victims. Unlike modern disasters where forensic teams work systematically to identify each recovered individual, where DNA analysis and dental records and personal effects are used to restore names to the nameless, the Wilhelm Gustloff's dead were never subjected to any such process. Those few bodies that were recovered in the immediate aftermath were buried in mass graves, their identities often unknown, their documentation having been lost along with the ship's manifest, which itself was incomplete given the chaos of the boarding process. The survivors who could have identified the dead were themselves traumatized, scattered, struggling for their own survival in a war that would continue for another 3 months, and a displacement that would continue far longer. The political circumstances that followed the war made any systematic effort at identification impossible, and by the time those circumstances changed, the passage of time had rendered such efforts moot. The dead remain anonymous, not because they could not be identified in principle, but because no one was in a position to identify them when identification was still possible. This anonymity extends to the historical record in ways that make the disaster both more and less accessible to those who encounter it. The Titanic's dead have names that can be listed and recited, families that can be traced, stories that can be reconstructed from letters and photographs, and the memories of descendants. The Wilhelm Gustloff's dead are largely statistical, numbers in an estimate that has been revised upward over the decades as researchers have attempted to account for the refugees who boarded without documentation, the soldiers who were added to the manifest at the last moment, the stowaways who simply appeared in the chaos and whose presence was never officially recorded. The number most commonly cited, 9,300, is itself an estimate derived from calculations about the ship's capacity and the conditions of boarding, not from any actual count of those lost. The true number may be higher, may be lower, cannot be determined with certainty, because the evidence that would allow certainty went down with the ship and has never been recovered. The families of the dead, those who survived the war and its aftermath, those who eventually learned what had happened to their relatives, have had to construct their own memorials and mourning practices without the usual supports. There are no individual graves to visit, no headstones to tend, no certain knowledge of where precisely their loved ones rest. The sea has become the grave, the entire Baltic a memorial that cannot be decorated or maintained in the ways that land-based memorials can. Some families have made pilgrimages to the Polish coast nearest the wreck site, have stood on beaches or piers and looked out at waters that hold what remains of their grandparents or great-grandparents. These pilgrimages are private acts of remembrance, documented occasionally in newspaper features or documentary interviews, but for the most part invisible to the broader public. The grief persists through generations in ways that are difficult to measure, difficult to articulate, difficult to distinguish from the broader German experience of loss and displacement and guilt that characterised the post-war decades. The survivors themselves, those who made it into the lifeboats or onto the rescue ships, those who endured the hours of cold and terror and emerged alive, have carried their own burdens across the intervening years. Many refuse to speak of the experience for decades, the trauma too immediate, too total, too connected to other traumas that the post-war period required Germans to process or suppress. Those who did speak often found their audiences unreceptive, either because the audiences were German and had their own stories of suffering that competed for attention, or because the audiences were not German and viewed any German claim to victimhood with suspicion. The children who survived, the youngest of the refugees, grew into adults who sometimes did not know what they had survived, whose memories of that night were fragmentary or suppressed, who discovered only later, through family discussions or historical research, that they had been present at one of the worst maritime disasters in history. The passage of time has thinned the ranks of survivors to almost nothing. A child of 5 in January 1945 would be 85 today, and the youngest survivors of the Wilhelm Gustloff are now among the oldest living humans, their memories of that night filtered through 8 decades of subsequent experience. The testimonies that were recorded in the 1990s and 2000s, when survivors were still numerous enough to be interviewed systematically, have become the primary record of lived experience, supplementing the documentary evidence that survived the disaster and the war. These testimonies vary in detail and emphasis, as all human testimony does, shaped by what the survivors witnessed personally, by what they learned afterward, by what they have chosen to remember or been unable to forget. Taken together, they provide a composite picture of the disaster that no single account could offer, a mosaic of individual experiences that collectively approach something like a complete picture without ever quite achieving it. The researchers and historians who have devoted their careers to studying the disaster have faced their own challenges, challenges of access and language and political sensitivity that have shaped what has been written and what remains unwritten. The primary sources are scattered across multiple countries and multiple archives, in Germany and Poland and Russia, in military records and civilian collections, in public repositories and private hands. The language barrier has been significant, with most documentary evidence existing in German, much of the relevant military material in Russian, and the contemporary scholarly context increasingly demanding English language publication. Translations exist, but are necessarily incomplete. necessarily filtered through the linguistic and cultural assumptions of the translators. The political sensitivities have evolved over the decades, but have never entirely disappeared. Writing about German civilian suffering remains fraught, requiring careful framing and acknowledgement of context that can overwhelm the narrative itself. The wreck continues to deteriorate, a fact that adds urgency to questions about documentation and preservation even as the answers to those questions remain contested. Every year that passes sees further collapse, further corrosion, further loss of structural integrity that makes any future investigation more difficult and more dangerous. The debris field expands as fragments detach from the main wreck and are carried by currents, or simply settle where gravity takes them. The interior spaces become more thoroughly sealed or more thoroughly destroyed, depending on the specific dynamics of each compartment. The oil continues to leak, and the fuel tanks continue to weaken, and the possibility of a catastrophic failure becomes neither more nor less likely, simply more immediate as time passes without intervention. Whatever decisions are eventually made about the wreck, whether to document it comprehensively before it is gone, whether to remove the environmental hazard it represents, whether to let it continue its slow collapse into the seabed, those decisions will be made by people who have no personal connection to the disaster, who know it only from books and photographs and the testimonies of those now almost all dead. The memorial efforts that do exist, the monuments and plaques and annual commemorations, tend to be modest affairs, known primarily to those with direct connections to the disaster or to the broader community of displaced Germans whose experiences the Wilhelm Gustloff symbolises. There is no grand museum dedicated to the sinking, no permanent exhibition that draws tourists and school groups the way the Titanic exhibitions do. The anniversary of the disaster passes each January with ceremonies that are reported in German media, but rarely noticed elsewhere, attended by survivors and their families, by local officials and historians, by a public that diminishes each year as the generation with living memory gives way to generations for whom the event is purely historical. The absence of grand commemoration does not diminish the weight of what occurred. It merely displaces that weight onto other vessels of memory, onto the written record and the oral tradition, and the physical remains that lie scattered across the Baltic seabed. The wreck itself has become the primary memorial, though it is a memorial that almost no one can visit, a monument sealed off from the world it commemorates. And perhaps there is something fitting in this, something appropriate about a disaster that has been so thoroughly marginalised in historical memory being preserved in a form that resists easy access. The Wilhelm Gustloff does not invite casual visitation. It does not welcome tourists or thrill seekers or the merely curious. It demands something more from anyone who would approach it, a willingness to confront the darkness it contains, the suffering it witnessed, the questions it continues to pose about the nature of catastrophe and the limits of human memory. The physical condition of the wreck tells its own story of decay and transformation, a process that began the moment the ship came to rest on the seafloor, and that will continue for centuries to come. The cold waters of the Baltic have slowed, but not stopped the processes of dissolution that work upon every vessel that sinks beneath the waves. The metal that once formed the hull and superstructure is slowly returning to the state from which it was refined, the iron oxidizing back toward ore, the steel losing its structural integrity as corrosion works along grain boundaries and weld lines. The rate of this transformation varies throughout the wreck, depending on local conditions of oxygen, concentration, and bacterial activity, and the specific composition of each structural element. Some areas retain surprising solidity even after 8 decades of immersion, while others have collapsed into tangles of rusted plating that bear little resemblance to their original form. The sections that were most heavily damaged during the sinking have deteriorated most rapidly, the torn edges of torpedo impacts providing entry points for the corrosive processes that work from the outside in. The superstructure, which was never designed to withstand the pressures of immersion, has fared particularly poorly, with portions of the upper decks having pancaked onto lower levels as supporting structures gave way. The biological communities that have colonised the wreck exist in a relationship with the ship that is simultaneously parasitic and protective. The organisms that encrust the exterior surfaces create a living barrier that slows direct contact between seawater and metal, but their metabolic processes also alter the local chemistry in ways that can accelerate corrosion. The bacteria that have penetrated the interior spaces break down organic materials with varying degrees of efficiency, consuming what can be consumed and leaving behind what cannot. The mussels and other filter feeders that coat the visible surfaces strain the water of particles, creating localized zones of clearer water, while simultaneously adding to the mass that the deteriorating structure must support. In some areas, the biological accretion has become so thick that the original surface of the ship is no longer visible, buried beneath centimetres of living and dead shell material that form a secondary hull around the primary one. In other areas, currents have prevented such accumulation, leaving the steel exposed to the full force of the corrosive environment. The result is a patchwork of conditions, with some sections looking almost preserved and others looking as though they might collapse at any moment. The interior of the wreck presents its own unique conditions, distinct from the external environment in ways that matter greatly for understanding what has happened there and what will continue to happen. The enclosed spaces have created their own microclimates, zones where oxygen is depleted or absent, where temperature remains constant regardless of seasonal variations above, where light has not penetrated since the day of the sinking. In some compartments, the absence of oxygen has effectively halted biological activity, creating conditions not unlike those of a natural preservation chamber. In others, different bacterial communities have taken hold, organisms that do not require oxygen and that produce different chemical byproducts, including the hydrogen sulfide that gives the deep interior its characteristic signature. The silt that has accumulated in many interior spaces has created additional barriers to both biological activity and investigative access, burying whatever lies beneath in layers of sediment that would need to be carefully removed before any examination could take place. This silt is not simply settled seafloor material, it includes organic matter that has filtered down through the wreck over decades, the products of decomposition from above, the remnants of bacterial communities that have lived and died within the ship's confines. The structural integrity of the wreck as a whole is a matter of ongoing concern for those who monitor such things, though the monitoring itself is sporadic and incomplete given the restrictions on access. The ship lies on its port side at an angle that places continuous stress on structural members that were never designed to bear loads in that orientation. What was once a floor is now a wall. What was once a wall is now either a ceiling or a floor, depending on which side of the ship one considers. The internal divisions that gave the vessel its compartmentalized structure are now tilted, their vertical and horizontal surfaces realigned in ways that redistribute forces throughout the hull. Some bulkheads have buckled under the strain, their riveted connections popping in sequences that can sometimes be heard by nearby monitoring equipment as the metal groans and shifts. Other structural elements have proven surprisingly resilient, the quality of their original construction manifesting in an ability to endure conditions far beyond their design parameters. The overall effect is of a structure in slow-motion collapse, not catastrophic failure but gradual yielding, a process measured in years and decades rather than minutes and hours. The fuel oil that remains within the ship's bunkers represents perhaps the most pressing practical concern associated with the wreck, a concern that extends beyond the historical and memorial dimensions of the site into the realm of active environmental management. When the Wilhelm Gustloff sank, her fuel tanks held an estimated quantity of heavy fuel oil sufficient to power the vessel across the Baltic and beyond, a reserve that was never consumed because the voyage never reached its destination. This oil has remained largely within the original tank structures, its density and viscosity helping it stay in place even as the surrounding metal has deteriorated. But no tank lasts forever under such conditions, and the seepage that has been observed indicates that the containment is no longer complete. Heavy fuel oil does not behave like lighter petroleum products when released underwater. It does not immediately rise to the surface in a dramatic slick. Instead, it tends to sink or form neutrally buoyant plumes, spreading through the water column in ways that can affect marine life at multiple depths. It coats substrates and organisms, interfering with the biological processes on which the Baltic ecosystem depends. It persists in the environment for years, resisting natural degradation and accumulating in sediments where it can be remobilized by storms or dredging or other disturbances. The question of whether to actively remove this oil is one that has been debated among the various stakeholders without clear resolution. The technical challenges are significant but not insurmountable. Similar operations have been conducted on other historic wrecks, including the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor, where the need to address ongoing fuel leakage has overridden concerns about disturbing a war grave. But each such operation requires balancing competing values, the environmental benefit of removal against the physical intrusion it requires, the financial cost against the resources available, the risk of disturbing human remains against the risk of leaving toxic material in place. For the Wilhelm Gustloff, these calculations are complicated by the multi-layered political sensitivities that surround the wreck, by the lack of a single authority with clear jurisdiction and responsibility, by the practical difficulties of working at depth in an area where conditions are often challenging. The result is a kind of paralysis, a situation where the problem is acknowledged, but action is perpetually deferred, while the deterioration continues and the eventual cleanup becomes both more necessary and more difficult. The ammunition and weapons that went down with the ship present a different category of concern, one that overlaps with the environmental issues but extends into questions of safety and security that add additional layers of complexity. Naval vessels of the Second World War era routinely carried substantial stores of ammunition, and while much of what the Wilhelm Gustloff carried when serving as a hospital ship would have been defensive armament only, the quantities involved were still significant. What happens to such ammunition over 8 decades of immersion is a question that depends on the specific types involved, on the conditions of storage, on the chemical composition of the explosives and propellants and detonators that made up each round. Some materials degrade in ways that render them inert, their chemical structures breaking down into compounds that no longer have explosive potential. Others become more dangerous over time, their stability decreasing as moisture penetrates casings and initiates reactions that can lead to spontaneous detonation. Still others remain essentially unchanged, waiting in the darkness for some disturbance that might trigger the release of energy they have stored for 8 decades. The protocols for dealing with unexploded ordnance in underwater archaeological contexts are well established but resource-intensive, requiring specialized personnel and equipment and a willingness to accept risks that most investigative projects would rather avoid. The standard procedure involves survey, identification, assessment, and either removal or in-place neutralization, each step requiring its own expertise and its own investment of time and resources. For a wreck the size of the Wilhelm Gustloff, with its multiple decks and compartments and the extensive debris field that has accumulated around it, such a comprehensive approach would represent a major undertaking even before the additional complications of war grave status and political sensitivities were considered. The practical result is that the ordnance, like the fuel oil, remains in place, a potential hazard whose probability of causing harm remains low, as long as the wreck is left undisturbed, but whose consequences could be severe if disturbance were to occur. The human remains within the wreck exist in conditions that vary dramatically depending on location and circumstance, a variation that reflects both the physics of decay and the specific histories of individual victims. Bodies that were trapped in enclosed spaces, particularly those in the lower reaches of the ship where conditions have remained most stable, may retain recognizable form even after all these decades, preserved by the cold and the darkness and the absence of the oxygen that most decomposition requires. Bodies that were exposed to open water, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the sinking when fish and other scavengers had access, would have been reduced to skeletal remains within months or years, their flesh consumed and their bones scattered by the same currents and creatures that continue to work upon the wreck. Bodies that were buried by collapsing structure or accumulating silt occupy an intermediate state, protected from biological consumption but subject to the chemical processes that slowly dissolve bone in the mildly acidic conditions that prevail in many marine environments. What any investigation would find depends entirely on where it looked and what conditions had prevailed in that specific location over the decades since the disaster. The personal effects that went down with the ship occupy their own category of preservation and decay, a category that includes everything from jewellery and watches to photographs and documents, to the clothing and luggage and household goods that the refugees carried aboard in their desperate flight. Metal objects have fared best, their resistance to biological consumption, and their relative stability in the marine environment, allowing them to retain recognizable form even when corroded or encrusted. Gold and silver survive almost unchanged, their chemical stability making them essentially permanent in any environment. Rings and watches and jewellery would still be identifiable as such if recovered, though they might require careful cleaning to reveal their original appearance. Iron and steel objects have corroded but often remain recognisable, their shapes preserved even as their surfaces transform. Organic materials have fared worse, with textiles and paper and leather deteriorating at rates that depend on their specific composition and location. In some areas, conditions have allowed remarkable preservation of even fragile materials. In others, nothing organic remains except the chemical signatures that decomposition leaves behind. The photographic record of the refugees' final days is almost entirely lost. The images that might have shown faces and families and individual lives destroyed, along with the cameras and film stocks that captured them. What photographs exist from that period tend to be official or journalistic rather than personal, images of crowds and ships and the general chaos of evacuation, rather than the intimate moments that families record for their own remembrance. The Wilhelm Gustloff appears in some of these photographs, recognisable by her distinctive profile, her white hull and red crosses marking her former status as a hospital ship, her decks crowded with the figures of refugees too numerous to count. These images have become iconic in the limited literature on the disaster, reproduced in books and documentaries and memorial exhibitions, representing in visual form what words can only approximate. They show the ship in her final days of operation, not the broken hulk she would become, and the contrast between these images of a functioning vessel and the wreck that now lies on the seafloor adds another dimension to the tragedy they represent. The testimonies of survivors have provided the most detailed and personal record of what occurred, though these too are subject to the limitations and distortions that all human memory entails. The survivors who were interviewed in subsequent decades spoke of what they had seen and heard and felt, of the chaos and the cold and the desperate struggle for survival. They spoke of the sounds that filled the night, the screaming and the explosions and the groaning of the ship as it tilted and sank. They spoke of the water, its temperature and its force, and the way it rose through corridors and compartments with a relentlessness that seemed almost intentional. They spoke of the choices they had made, the people they had helped or failed to help, the moments when survival had depended on decisions made in seconds without time for thought. These testimonies are precious precisely because they are human, because they convey what no documentary record can capture, the lived experience of disaster as it unfolds in real time around individuals who do not know what will happen next. The psychological dimensions of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate trauma of the sinking, affecting survivors and rescuers and families of the dead in ways that persisted for decades and in some cases for entire lifetimes. The survivors carried their experiences with them into the post-war world, into lives that were shaped by what they had witnessed and what they had lost. Many never spoke of it publicly, the burden of memory too heavy to share, and the political climate of post-war Germany too complicated to allow for open discussion of German civilian suffering. Others spoke only within family circles, passing their stories to children and grandchildren who would carry them forward into generations that had no direct connection to the event. The silence that surrounded the disaster for so many years was not simply a product of external suppression, but also of internal necessity, a way of managing pain that could not be expressed in any public forum that existed at the time. The children who survived the disaster faced their own particular challenges, their young minds processing experiences that exceeded their capacity to understand. Some were old enough to remember clearly what had happened, to carry detailed memories of the night and its horrors into their adult lives. Others were young enough that their memories were fragmentary or absent entirely, knowing that they had been aboard the ship only because their families told them so, unable to distinguish genuine recollection from stories they had heard repeated throughout their childhoods. These survivors grew up in a world that had little interest in their experiences, that was focused on rebuilding and moving forward rather than looking back at the catastrophes of the recent past. They made their lives as best they could, carrying their survivor status as a hidden mark that shaped their identities in ways that were not always visible to those around them. The families of those who died faced the absence of closure that such disasters impose, the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what had happened to their loved ones in the final moments. Unlike disasters where bodies are recovered and identified, where funerals can be held and graves can be visited, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff left most families with nothing but questions. Their relatives had boarded the ship in Gottenhafen and had not arrived at the destination. Beyond this basic fact, what had happened remained largely unknowable. Had they drowned in their cabins when the torpedo struck? Had they made it to the deck only to die of exposure in the freezing water? Had they been among the few who reached the lifeboats or the rescue ships? For most families, these questions could never be answered with certainty. The specific circumstances of individual deaths lost along with the lives themselves. The weight of such uncertainty does something to those left behind, something that accumulates over years and decades and eventually across generations themselves. The families who waited in ports that the Wilhelm Gustloff would never reach, who scanned lists of survivors that grew shorter with each passing day, who eventually abandoned hope and began the impossible work of mourning without confirmation. These families carried a particular kind of grief. It was grief without an anchor, without a grave to visit, without a definitive moment when death could be acknowledged, and the process of acceptance could begin. The ship itself became the grave, sealed beneath the waters of the Baltic with its thousands of dead still aboard, and yet the families could not reach it, could not stand beside it, could not perform the rituals of remembrance that human beings have developed over millennia to help them process loss. This absence of closure is not merely a bureaucratic inconvenience or an administrative gap. It is a wound that refuses to close entirely, that reopens at anniversaries and family gatherings and quiet moments, when memory asserts itself against the tide of daily life. The post-war decades saw the disaster recede from public consciousness in ways that reflected the broader political and cultural currents of the era. In the German Democratic Republic, the eastern state that emerged from the Soviet occupation zone, the narrative was carefully controlled to emphasize German culpability and Soviet victory. The civilian deaths aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff found no place in this framework, which viewed German suffering as an inevitable and perhaps justified consequence of German aggression. To mourn the dead openly would have complicated the official story, would have introduced ambiguity into a historical narrative that the state preferred to keep simple. The survivors who found themselves living in the East learned quickly to keep their silence, to share their memories only in private spaces where the state's attention did not reach. In the Federal Republic of Germany, the Western state that aligned itself with the American and British occupation powers, the dynamics were different, but the result was similar. The focus on reconstruction and integration into the Western alliance left little room for dwelling on the catastrophes of the war years, particularly catastrophes that involved German civilian casualties at the hands of what were now potential allies in the struggle against Soviet influence. The Wilhelm Gustloff became an awkward memory, neither suitable for public mourning nor entirely forgotten, existing in a twilight zone of collective consciousness where it was acknowledged but not discussed, remembered but not commemorated. The historical profession itself struggled with the disaster, caught between the imperative to document all aspects of the past and the political sensitivities that surrounded any narrative that might appear to minimize German responsibility for the war. Serious scholarship on the sinking was sparse for decades, the subject relegated to specialized military histories and maritime disaster catalogues that reached limited audiences. When the disaster did appear in broader historical accounts, it was often mentioned briefly, its death toll noted with something approaching embarrassment, before the narrative moved on to topics that fitted more comfortably into established frameworks of interpretation. This scholarly reticence began to shift only gradually, as the passage of time created space for more nuanced approaches to the history of the war and its human costs. The recognition that acknowledging German civilian suffering need not imply equivalence with or excuse for German crimes opened new possibilities for historical investigation, allowing researchers to explore the disaster with greater depth and sensitivity than had previously been possible. The physical remains of the Wilhelm Gustloff, meanwhile, lay in the darkness of the Baltic, settling into the seabed and becoming part of the underwater landscape in ways that mirrored its ambiguous status in human memory. The ship came to rest in waters that would later fall under Polish jurisdiction, a consequence of the post-war border changes that transferred the former German territories of Pomerania and the Polish corridor to Polish sovereignty. This geographic shift transformed the legal and political context of the wreck, making it subject to Polish law and Polish decisions about how it should be treated. The Polish authorities, inheritors of a maritime tragedy that had occurred during a war they had not started and had suffered from grievously, faced difficult questions about how to handle the site. The ship contained not only thousands of human remains, but also materials that posed environmental and safety risks, including munitions and fuel that had not been expended before the sinking. These practical concerns intertwined with ethical questions about respect for the dead and historical questions about the meaning and significance of the disaster. The decision to designate the wreck as a protected war grave reflected a recognition that the Wilhelm Gustloff was not simply a piece of underwater debris, but a place of profound human tragedy that deserved protection from exploitation and desecration. This designation carried legal weight, prohibiting diving and salvage operations without special authorization and establishing penalties for those who violated the site's protected status. The prohibition on diving was not merely bureaucratic caution, but an acknowledgement that the wreck remained a final resting place for thousands of people whose bodies had never been recovered, whose families had never been able to bury them properly, whose deaths deserved the respect that society extends to graves on land. To allow unrestricted access would have been to treat the site as a curiosity or a source of artifacts rather than as sacred ground, to permit the kinds of intrusions that would be unthinkable in a cemetery or memorial on the surface. Yet the protected status of the wreck also served to compound the already considerable challenges of historical documentation and remembrance. The physical evidence of the disaster, the structural damage from the torpedoes, the positions of bodies and personal effects, the state of the ship's systems and compartments, all of this remained largely inaccessible to researchers and to the families who might have found some measure of closure in understanding more precisely what had happened. The few authorized expeditions that have descended to the wreck have returned with images and data that illuminate aspects of the disaster, but comprehensive archaeological investigation of the kind that has been conducted on other significant wrecks remains impossible under current restrictions. The ship keeps its secrets. Its interior space is dark and silent and filled with evidence that may never be fully examined. Its testimony locked away in depths that human beings can reach, but are not permitted to explore. The environmental dimension of the wreck adds another layer of complexity to questions about its future. The ship went down with fuel in its bunkers and ammunition in its magazines, materials that have aged now for 8 decades beneath the cold waters of the Baltic. The condition of these materials, the extent to which they have degraded or remained stable, the risks they might pose if disturbed or if natural processes eventually breach their containment, these are questions that require ongoing monitoring and assessment. The Baltic Sea itself is an environment under stress, its waters receiving pollutants from the industrialized nations that surround it, its ecosystems struggling to maintain themselves against the pressures of human activity. The Wilhelm Gustloff represents just one of many wrecks from the 2 world wars that lie on the seabed of this enclosed sea. A fleet of sunken vessels that collectively hold quantities of oil and chemicals and explosives that could prove problematic if released. The management of these wrecks is not merely a historical or commemorative challenge, but an environmental one, requiring expertise in marine science and hazardous materials alongside the historical and ethical considerations that would apply regardless of what the ships contain. The question of salvage has arisen periodically over the decades, raised by those who see in the wreck a resource to be exploited or a problem to be solved through removal. Various schemes have been proposed for raising the ship or portions of it, for extracting valuables that might remain aboard, for eliminating the environmental risks through controlled demolition, or comprehensive salvage operations. None of these proposals have proceeded to implementation, blocked by the legal protection surrounding the site, by the technical challenges of working at such depths on a vessel of such size, and by the ethical objections that would greet any attempt to disturb the dead for commercial gain. The wreck remains where it sank, deteriorating slowly under the processes of corrosion and marine growth and the patient work of time itself. The steel that once carried thousands of refugees now hosts colonies of marine organisms, the ship becoming part of an ecosystem that has formed around it over decades. This transformation from human artifact to underwater habitat carries its own ambiguity. The ship both persisting as a structure and disappearing into its environment, both maintaining its identity as the Wilhelm Gustloff and becoming something else entirely. For the survivors, those who had pulled themselves from the freezing water, or had been lifted from lifeboats, or had clung to wreckage until rescue arrived. The decades after the disaster brought the ongoing challenge of living with memories that could neither be erased nor fully expressed. They watched the world change around them, watched Germany divide and reunify, watched the Cold War begin and end, watched generations grow up with no direct memory of what had happened in the waters off Stoltmünde on that January night. Some survivors became advocates for remembrance, working to ensure that the disaster would not be entirely forgotten, speaking to schools and historical societies and journalists who showed interest in their stories. Others maintained their silence to the end, taking their experiences with them when they died, leaving behind families who knew only fragments of what their relatives had endured. The dynamics of survivor communities shifted over time as the original witnesses aged and passed away, their numbers diminishing with each year until only a handful remained, and then fewer still, and then none at all. The transition from living memory to historical memory is always fraught, the loss of direct witnesses changing fundamentally the relationship between the present and the past. When the last survivor dies, the disaster becomes something different than it was, no longer a matter of personal testimony, but solely of documentation and interpretation. The families of survivors face their own challenges of remembrance, inheritors of stories that shaped their parents and grandparents in ways that can be difficult to comprehend from the outside. These second and third generation witnesses carry forward narratives that are not their own, that they know only through the mediation of family transmission, that they must interpret and preserve without the grounding of direct experience. They have formed organisations and networks dedicated to preserving the memory of the disaster, to honouring both those who died and those who survived, to ensuring that the historical record remains accessible to future generations who will be even further removed from the events themselves. These efforts represent a form of collective memory work that is familiar from other historical tragedies, the ongoing labour of keeping the past present even as time works inexorably to push it into obscurity. The broader question of how societies remember and forget their tragedies finds particularly sharp expression in the case of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The disaster challenges conventional frameworks of historical memory in ways that make it uncomfortable to contemplate, that resist the simplifications that memorial culture often requires. It was a German tragedy, yes, but one that occurred within the context of a war that Germany had started and crimes that Germany had committed. It was a Soviet attack, yes, but one that was legally permissible under the rules of war, and that occurred against a nation that had invaded Soviet territory and murdered Soviet citizens by the millions. It was a civilian disaster, yes, but one that involved civilians who were fleeing the consequences of a war machine they had supported or tolerated, or simply been caught up in through the accident of their nationality and their location. These complexities resist the kind of clear moral framing that memorial culture often seeks, the identification of innocent victims and guilty perpetrators that provides a foundation for commemoration and mourning. And yet the dead were overwhelmingly civilians, overwhelmingly women and children, overwhelmingly people who had no meaningful agency in the decisions that had led to the war, and were simply trying to escape its consequences when the torpedoes struck. The children who drowned in the flooding compartments of the Wilhelm Gustloff bore no responsibility for National Socialism or for the crimes of the German state. The women who froze in the water while waiting for rescue that would not come had not chosen the policies that made them refugees. The elderly who died in the chaos had committed no war crimes, had simply lived in a nation that had gone terribly wrong, and had found themselves caught in the disaster that followed. To acknowledge their deaths as tragedy, to mourn them as human beings who died terrified and in pain and far too young, is not to excuse the broader context of German aggression, but simply to recognise the humanity that persists even within the most morally complicated of situations. The philosophical dimensions of the disaster extend into questions that have occupied thinkers for centuries, questions about the meaning of mass death and the limits of human comprehension when confronted with suffering on such a scale. 9,400 people is a number that defies easy visualization, that exceeds the capacity of the individual mind to grasp as a collection of particular human beings, rather than as an abstract quantity. We can understand what it means for one person to die, can imagine their final moments and their unfulfilled hopes and the grief of those who loved them. We can perhaps extend this understanding to a few dozen deaths, holding in mind a group of individuals each with their own story and their own significance. But when the numbers climb into the thousands and the tens of thousands, when they become statistics rather than stories, something changes in our ability to apprehend them as fully human tragedies. The Wilhelm Gustloff challenges us to resist this numbing, to remember that the death toll was not 9,400 abstractions, but 9,400 separate people, each of whom experienced their death as the end of their particular world, each of whom left behind someone who mourned them. The question of what we owe to the dead is never simple, and it becomes particularly complex when the dead are so numerous and so inaccessible and so entangled in historical circumstances that resist easy judgment. Do we owe them remembrance, the maintenance of their names and stories in the collective memory of humanity? Do we owe them truth, the commitment to understanding and documenting what happened to them with as much accuracy as the evidence allows? Do we owe them respect, the treatment of their remains and their resting place with the dignity that we would want for our own? Do we owe them justice, whatever that might mean in circumstances where the perpetrators have long since died and the political entities responsible have long since ceased to exist? These questions have no final answers, but the asking of them is itself a form of response, a way of refusing to let the dead slip entirely into the oblivion that time always threatens. The ship lies still in the darkness of the Baltic, its hull encrusted now with decades of marine growth, its compartments filled with the cold water that rushed in on that January night so long ago. Light does not reach it, not the sunlight that plays on the surface, nor the moonlight that would have shone on the refugees as they gathered on the deck in those final hours. The silence down there is complete, broken only by the movements of fish and the slow processes of decay that continue their work regardless of human attention or inattention. The personal effects of the dead remain where they fell, scattered across decks and through corridors and into the hidden spaces where people sought refuge that would not come. Somewhere in that darkness are the toys that children were carrying, the photographs that families had brought as their only memorials of lives they were leaving behind, the documents and letters and small precious objects that people had selected from among all their possessions as the things they could not bear to lose. These artifacts wait in the cold, preserving traces of the lives that ended here, testifying silently to the human dimension of the disaster, even as the years accumulate and the world above continues its restless turning. The survivors who remained always spoke of the cold. In every testimony, in every interview, in every written account, the cold emerges as the defining physical reality of the disaster, the element that determined who lived and who died once the ship had sunk beneath the waves. The water temperature of the Baltic on that January night was close to freezing, a temperature that the human body can endure for only minutes before hypothermia sets in, before muscles stop responding and consciousness fades and the heart itself gives up its struggle. Those who survived were almost without exception those who escaped the water quickly, who found their way onto lifeboats or rescue ships or pieces of wreckage, large enough to keep them clear of the deadly cold. Those who fell into the water and remained there for more than a few minutes had virtually no chance, their bodies succumbing to temperatures that no amount of willpower or physical fitness could overcome. The cold was impersonal, killing without preference or intention, taking children and adults and the strong and the weak with equal efficiency. It is the cold that survivors remember most vividly, the cold that haunted their dreams for years afterward, the cold that became the defining sensory memory of the night. What remains when we have considered all of this, when we have traced the history and documented the deaths and examined the aftermath and reflected on the meaning? What remains is the fact of the disaster itself, irreducible and permanent, a fixed point in history around which interpretation and memory and forgetting will continue to circulate for as long as human beings maintain any connection to this past. The Wilhelm Gustloff sailed from Gotenhafen on January 30th, 1945, and it did not reach its destination. The torpedoes struck, and the ship went down, and more than 9,000 people died in circumstances of terror and cold and desperate struggle. This happened. It cannot be undone or erased, or made to have never been. It can only be remembered or forgotten, acknowledged or ignored, and the choice between these alternatives is not merely academic but moral, a decision about what kind of relationship we wish to maintain with the human beings who came before us and whose experiences, however different from our own, remain part of the inheritance we carry forward. The wreck will endure for decades more, perhaps for centuries, deteriorating gradually but persisting as a physical trace of what occurred. Eventually it will collapse entirely, its steel consumed by corrosion, its structure reduced to unrecognizable fragments scattered across the seabed. The dead within it will be dispersed, their bones dissolved, their physical traces returned to the elements from which they were made. This dissolution is the fate that awaits all human remains, all human artifacts, all human memory in the long sweep of geological time. But we do not live in geological time. We live in human time, in the span of years and decades and generations that constitutes our horizon of care and attention. Within that horizon, the Wilhelm Gustloff remains present, the largest loss of life in any single maritime disaster in recorded history, a catastrophe that dwarfs the tragedies we know far better and speak of far more often. The children who died there, the 4,000 children whose lives ended before they had truly begun, they are the most difficult to contemplate and the most important to remember. They had done nothing, knew nothing, were responsible for nothing except the accident of having been born in a place and a time that would betray them. They deserved lives, full lives, lives in which they would grow up and learn and love and make the countless choices that constitute a human existence. They received instead a night of terror and a death in cold water, their small bodies lost to the depths along with the adults who had tried and failed to save them. If there is a reason to remember the Wilhelm Gustloff, to resist its slide into obscurity, to insist on its place in the historical record and in collective memory, it is for their sake. Not because their deaths were more significant than the deaths of others, but because the deaths of children always demand our attention, always call us to account, always ask us to explain how the world we have made could allow such things to happen. The Baltic keeps its secret still, the dark water closing over the wreck as it has closed over so much else, the forgotten losses and the unrecorded deaths, and the countless individual tragedies that history has never named. The Wilhelm Gustloff lies among them, silent now, its passengers beyond suffering and beyond rescue, waiting in the cold depths for a remembrance that may or may not come. We cannot reach them, cannot comfort them, cannot undo what was done to them on that January night 8 decades ago. We can only remember, can only speak their names when we know them, and acknowledge their existence when we do not, can only refuse the easy path of forgetting, and choose instead the harder work of keeping faith with the dead. They asked nothing of us, expected nothing from us, could not have imagined us in their final moments of struggle and fear. But we are here now, and they are not, and the asymmetry between the living and the dead creates obligations that transcend the impossibility of fulfillment. We remember, because remembering is what the living owe to those who came before, because the alternative is a world in which 9,400 people can vanish into the cold and the dark and leave no trace at all. The ship went down with almost everyone aboard. The water was cold beyond imagining. The night was long, and the rescue ships were few, and most of those who needed saving could not be saved. This is what happened. This is what we know. This is what remains.